Good morning, bonjour, bon matin. My name is Claudette Tardif. I'm pleased to be presiding this second panel. I was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 2005. Prior to that, I was very fortunate in having served 28 years at this distinguished university, the University of Alberta, as a professor, researcher, dean, and then Vice President, External Affairs. I'm so pleased to be back to preside this panel at my alma mater. And I must say, it was wonderful to hear the first panel. I think it really set the stage following what happened last evening as well with the Right Honourable Kim Campbell's presentation. We're off to a very good start. And this second panel will be looking at the theme of looking back, looking forward, framing reform. We have three distinguished speakers for this second panel. To my far left, Professor David Smith, distinguished visiting professor and professor emeritus at Ryerson University, and as well at Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Regina. Professor Smith taught in the Department of Political Studies, University of Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, from 1964 until 2004, and is a previous president of the Canadian Political Science Association. His research interests include political parties, the Constitution, and federalism. Our second speaker, Professor Laurie Turnbull. Laurie Turnbull is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie University. She teaches courses in introductory politics, Canadian parliamentary governance, and pressure politics. Her major area of research are Canadian parliamentary governance, political ethics, elections, electoral systems, and public engagement. Laurie, I'm just thinking, you told me last evening that you were now at Carleton University. Is that correct?
Yes, the first thing I was going to do when it's my turn to speak is poke holes into my my biography. I was always at Dalhousie, but starting this year I'm at Carleton in the School of Public Policy.
Okay, great.
But the rest is all true.
Great. And next to me, Professor Linda Trimble. Linda is a professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta, where she has been teaching courses on Canadian politics since 1989. And she insists on educating her students about the Senate, notwithstanding its reputation as an outmoded and largely irrelevant political institution. An award-winning teacher and recent winner of a prize for excellence in mentoring, Dr. Trimble's research explores media coverage of politics and women's legislative representation. We are very fortunate to have these three distinguished speakers with us today. We will begin with Professor Smith. There will be time left for questions. We will assure that our speakers respect the time limit that they have been given in order to allow for engagement with the audience here today. Professor Smith, will you begin, please?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. The title of my address is The New Potential for Parliamentary Bicameralism. Except for the change in 1965 from appointment of senators for life to retirement at age 75, the Senate on the eve of Canada's 150th birthday continues essentially the same institution the Fathers of Confederation designed and approved. There's no mystery why Senate reform remains a subject for talk but no action. The answer is to be found not in what the Senate isn't, elected or equal, but in what it is, one part of Canada's most visible political institution. In other words, the core explanation for resistance to reform lies in bicameralism, a subject which, despite its prominence in the Constitution Act, is scarcely discussed in Canadian political science literature. Among the reasons for omission are the contagion of provincial unicameralism. Except for the Senate, Canadians have no knowledge and little memory of second chambers, and long-standing derision of the one second chamber that they actually have. Proposals for Senate reform usually begin with the premise that the upper chamber lacks legitimacy, a want of respectability which, according to this argument, may be remedied only from outside Parliament. Implicit is the proposition that the Senate exists to fulfill a purpose for instance, represent the people or governments of the provinces. The indictment is narrowly cast, the argument aesthetic. Critics see the Senate through the prism of second chamber theory rather than as part of Canada's distinctive form of federalism. Never is there acknowledgement that the Senate is the only institution purposely designed by the Fathers of Confederation to serve the needs of the new Dominion of Canada. Comparisons are said to be invidious. I do not agree, and therefore will cite Patrick Boyer, a former member of Parliament and author of Our Scandalous Senate, to illustrate my point. He writes, quote, that the single greatest role of the Senate was this: enabling Confederation to take place at all. The day Confederation became a reality, the Senate's principal function had been fulfilled, end quote. For such interpreters, the Senate is weightless as an institution, its decades of history telescoped into one moment of time. On this last point, it's worth remembering the Fathers of Confederation were intent on having a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. Distrusting mechanical forms or abstract doctrines, the architects of Confederation, particularly those who had sat in the legislative bodies of United Canada, valued the accommodative capacity of parliamentary institutions. The same men had labored for a quarter of a century under the constraints imposed by the Act of Union of 1841. Experience disposed them to respect practice and precedent in the realm of politics. Thus, rather than a demonstration of theory, the Senate stands as a testament to what the framers of the Constitution thought Canada required to be a united country. More important still, and unlike critics today, they saw the Senate not in isolation, but in association with the House of Commons, for the reason that together each chamber served the needs of what might be described as Canada's double federation, 2 nations and ultimately 10 provinces. Parliament's upper house offered a platform for expressing concerns about the Federation and minorities. Unlike members of Parliament, senators were not, in and of themselves, reflections or imitations of something else. They were not accountable to a constituency, however defined, or obliged to interpret legislation in any predetermined way. 2 consequences flowed from this feature. Bicameralism assumed fundamental, even existential importance. The 2 chambers must work, and they must work in tandem for the benefit of the Canadian people, wherever they might live. At the same time, the second chamber must not rival the first. It must never, in other words, be elected by a constituency, since a democratic vote for the Senate would devalue everything but that vote. If this were to happen, conflict between the chambers would follow, and the Senate's function as a moderating and unifying agent would be jeopardized. Senate thought would no longer be sober, that is, contemplative, nor would it logically come second. In their opposition to the upper chamber, Boyer, as well as some historians, Christopher Moore, for instance, personify, to my mind at least, an insular Ontario preference for majoritarianism. The difference between them and George Brown, who did favor a unicameral Ontario legislature, is that Brown realized the Federation demanded at the center what was not required in the parts, a bicameral parliament, to help resolve regional tension. It may be an exaggeration, but it is not false to say that those who share this indictment of the upper chamber appear to be committed to the proposition that every man is or should be his own legislator. In consequence, the Senate as an institution is disparaged, its history disregarded. The physics of a unicameral parliament preoccupy their attention. For instance, according to Boyer, there are, quote, 2 solitudes of sovereign power, the Crown and the people, even though that last solitude does not exist in Canada, where, unlike the United States, there is no theory of popular sovereignty embedded in its Constitution. Boyer employs the word people as a synonym for electoral democracy, a usage that again delegitimizes the Canadian model of bicameralism. To what extent, one wonders, is this malapropism attributable to the Canadian practice of claiming a constitution by association? Whether it is found in the preamble to the Constitution Act 1867 or even earlier in Governor Simcoe's description of the Constitutional Act 1791 as, quote, a perfect image and transcript of the British Constitution. Why, one wonders, is that the Canadians never manage to be at the heart of their own story. The British analogy refuses to acknowledge the uniqueness and strength of the Canadian upper house. To begin with, its history is different from that of the House of Lords. There never were barons in Canada. The test of the Senate lies in what it does, usually in concert with the Commons, and what it does in structure and practice is to validate Canada's distinctive form of federalism, a subject ignored by those who criticize the Senate on the grounds that it is undemocratic. More than that, this charge fails to acknowledge the primacy the Supreme Court has repeatedly awarded federalism. Quote, the dominant principle of Canadian constitutional law is federalism, the patriation reference. One of the Constitution's principles is federalism as the system of the country's government, the secession reference. The Senate is a core component of the Canadian federal system of government, the Senate reference. Bicameralism was as vital to the peace, order, and good government of Canada as the division of powers was to preserving the Federation. Federalism was about more than resolving the conflicts of united Canada, although it is the case that political problems in that colony drove the Confederation initiative. The original Union comprised 3 former colonies, then 4 provinces. Though few in number, those provinces were unequal, extremely so in size and population. The Senate was designed to secure the voice of maritime and minority interests generally in the Parliament, whose lower house, based on rep by pop, overwhelmingly advanced the concerns of central Canada. Sherbrooke's Alexander Galt spoke especially for the provinces east of the Ottawa River when, at the Quebec Conference, he prophesied, quote, to the Legislative Council, all the provinces look for protection under the federal principle. Patronage and Senate appointments in particular, as well as appointment over election itself, are regularly cited to disparage the second chamber, as well as Macdonald's known preference for legislative over federal union. It is ironic, therefore, that Macdonald, the feigned federalist of this interpretation, should a century and a half later be celebrated as the preeminent nation builder of the world's most extensive federation. The object of criticism since its birth, the Senate of Canada has never been described as impotent. Indeed, its potential for legislative influence is the factor that traditionally agitates the critics. The Senate's powers today are the same as they were at its creation. Indeed, every feature of the upper chamber, except term of appointment, is as it was then. It is imperative to be clear as to the Senate's fundamental features. First, and as just noted, senators hold their positions until age 75. Second, there is a fixed number of senators, 24 per division, of which there are 4 plus 9 add-ons. 2 divisions are single provinces. The other divisions have 3 and 4 provinces, respectively. A consequence of this limitation is that the Senate, at 105 members, is less than 1/3 the size of the House of Commons, almost intimate in atmosphere. Third, and to repeat, the number is fixed and it's extremely difficult to add extra members, a feat done only once. And fourth and last is that senators are appointed on recommendation of the Prime Minister by the Governor General. Why did the Fathers of Confederation decide upon these particular features for the Senate when in structure and operation the House of Commons was an imitation of the Commons at Westminster, while the Crown was assimilated totally into the Canadian Constitution? Constitutional monarchy makes explicable, if not acceptable to some, appointment of senators by the Crown on advice of the Prime Minister. There is no need to rehearse the arguments against an appointed upper house. They are well known. What can be said is that constitutional monarchy offered the Fathers of Confederation a practicable method of selecting senators to the upper house at a time when there were few alternatives. Election was not popular in United Canada after the experiment initiated in the 1850s. More than that, revitalization of the upper house through election relied on a theory of the balanced constitution where, quote, each branch should be independent of the other, a theory largely destroyed by the rise of responsible government. At the same time, selection by provincial legislatures of delegates from among their numbers to sit at the center, as was done in 19th century United States, violated the common sense of Parliament as a supreme legislative power, as in the United Kingdom, and the belief that British North Americans held that creation of a national Parliament marked an important step to constitutional maturity. According to Bourneau, the only examples in the 19th century of unicameral polities were the republics of Central America and the Balkan states, not examples to be copied by Canada. Membership in the upper chamber is by senatorial region. The guarantee of fixed, equal, regional, but not provincial representation with the more populous provinces of Ontario and Quebec was responsible for the entry of the maritime colonies. On no other condition would we have advanced a step, said George Brown. The Senate was a form of negotiated compensation for securing rep by pop in the House of Commons. Compensation to Quebec for what it had lost, which was equal representation in the Parliament of United Canada, and compensation for the Maritimes for what areas of growth elsewhere would gain. In consequence of that agreement, it was possible to view British North America, at least when looking at Parliament's upper chamber, in the words of Christopher Duncan, the minister in charge of the first census after 1867, as three kingdoms. What was missing in the analogy, however, was federalism. Although Canada was a federal union, its politicians said amazingly little about this feature of the Constitution, except to haggle over the division of power. The Macdonald government had no vision because it had no theory as to how federalism would expand, and thus was left to react to Louis Riel's multiple demands following the rebellion at Red River. David Mills, a liberal journalist and later cabinet minister, charged the Conservatives with failing, quote, to do what the theory of their system required. A criticism borne out when introducing the Manitoba Act, the Prime Minister told the House that it was, quote, not of great importance whether the province was called a province or a territory. We have provinces of all shapes, sizes, constitutions, so that there could not be anything determined by the use of that word. This failure to think through the imperative of federalism, how to expand the territory but not jeopardize the terms of the original agreement, has proved a major obstacle to achieving harmony in the Canadian political system. The disequilibrium caused by the acquisition of the West has never been righted, at least not in the eyes of the West. Although attempts to assure the maritime provinces that they would not be overwhelmed by new provinces with large settler populations led in time to guarantees that made changes to the structure of the Senate almost impossible to achieve. Debate over what became the Constitution Act 1915, which among other objects created a fourth Western senatorial division, prompted maritime disquiet at its prospects in Confederation compared to those of the booming West. A sample of that unease may be found in a passage of their Memorandum on Representation of the Maritime Provinces, 1914. Each colony, it said, has a right to adequate representation. A self-governing colony is more than the number of its inhabitants. But the Constitution Act 1915 went much further. No province, it said, was to have fewer members than it had senators. And the Constitution Act 1982, Section 41, made this guarantee one of four specified matters requiring unanimous consent for their amendment. Thus was created a Herculean obstacle to Senate reform touching the subject of membership numbers. Playwright Samuel Beckett once exclaimed, "Ah, the old questions, the old answers, there's nothing like them." Yet in the matter of the Senate, the clarity of the Supreme Court's recent opinion permits an escape from the quest for the grail of legitimacy and opens the door to new thoughts on an old institution. Of course, the Senate of Canada remains preeminently a legislative body whose authority derives from being one part of Parliament. Nonetheless, the precision of the opinion, preceded by the decision of the leader of the Liberal Party to sever senators from the Liberal caucus, presents an opportunity for the Senate to become more like the legislative institution Canadians say they want, less partisan, more open to the public, more collegial in the conduct of its business. The Senate is better situated than the Commons to connect with the public. With lower voter turnout generally, and especially among younger Canadians, the ballot has become the equivalent of a ticket of admission to formal political participation. Michael Adams of Environics has demonstrated that political parties earn the least respect among political institutions, with only 7% of Canadians trusting them a lot, compared to 32% who don't trust them at all. There is nothing to stop the Senate from creating opportunities to listen to public opinion. To some extent, it already does this. In some respects, its form is better suited for this purpose than a party-aligned House of Commons. Support for the Senate among informed and active Canadians originates in the knowledge of the accessibility of the chamber. Thousands of witnesses over the years cannot be wrong. The opinion of the Supreme Court of Canada has made clear that independence is a primary characteristic expected of the Senate. Independence is not an adjective associated with the tone or operation of the Commons, nor is this a matter of choice. The Constitution requires the Senate to fulfill its fundamental roles and responsibilities. Ignorance, apathy, or a disinclination to act no longer suffice to explain inaction. Canada is a country of contrasts, smallness versus bigness. Because of the Commons is comprised of small constituencies and the Senate of a few large divisions, one would expect that the focus of the Commons business would be on the small and the Senate on the big. However, there is a counter-argument. First, there is a very big difference in the size of the two chambers, as I said, 105 versus 338 with the next election, and in contrasting trajectories of growth. The House of Commons in 1917 had 235 members. Today it has 338. The House of Commons has increased by the very size of the Senate in the last century. The Senate has increased by 9 seats in that time. Second, the House of Commons would be expected to represent smallness because of the multitude and variety of constituencies. But political party discipline annihilates localism and always has. The smaller, more independent Senate is better positioned to articulate specific concern, whether or not rooted in geography. Third, the Commons is highly polarized in an era when the public is more pluralistic and volatile in party affiliation. Again, according to Michael Adams, since 2012, more than half of the population has been active in the last year, signing petitions, sharing political information online, participating in demonstrations and protest marches. Political activity on the internet is growing rapidly, especially social media. It is most popular among younger Canadians, those under the age of 30, 45% of them, who are more than twice as likely to use social media for political expression than those 60 years of age or over, 19%. A number of reasons may be offered for this development, but one relevant to this discussion is offered by Australian Judith Brett. People do not like the tone of parliamentary conflict. For those experienced with the modern informal meeting and its consensual style of reaching a decision, parliamentary procedure is no longer seen as enabling, but as precluding cooperative action. Canadian research supports this opinion. Half of Canadians, 50%, strongly agree with the following statement: political parties should allow MPs to vote in Parliament according to what they believe is right, even if it is not consistent with their party's position, with very few, 6%, opposed to that statement. The Senate has a reputation for being accessible and scrupulous in the conduct of its legislative work. I would cite here its examination of the Fair Elections Act last year. Embracing these qualities, the Senate acts as a bridge to the public whose concerns most often are not political, so much as concerns about the workplace, family, religion, health, diversity, citizenship. These are not constituency or regional issues, as those terms are generally understood. Like the country it serves, the Senate has demonstrated a capacity for adaptation and may still do so. Distinctively Canadian at its creation, it remains so 150 years on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith. Our next speaker will be Professor Laurie Turnbull.
Okay, I'm going to follow David's lead by standing up, mostly because the 4-hour-plus flight later will be enough time to sit down, so I'm going to stand up now. I might be a little bit not like the others in the sense that I don't do a lot of research that's focused exclusively on the Senate. Mine is more situating the Senate in the larger context of Parliament and of responsible government. And so I think rather than delving deeply into the Supreme Court decision or things that really pertain specifically to the Senate, what I'll be talking about is more of an overview and what role the Senate plays in responsible government. So my main topic is Senate independence. I'm going to come to that. In the context of responsible government, I think that the Senate has a very important role to play and very important responsibilities. To act as a check on executive power, which is heavily concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, to provide a close scrutiny of legislation, at times to make amendments and perhaps even reject legislation, to act as a check on the House of Commons, specifically the elected House of Commons, and to represent specifically the regions. Now, I would argue that the Prime Minister's greatest power, and this manifests itself in a number of ways, and I can talk about that, but that's not really what we're here to talk about. The Prime Minister's greatest power is the power of appointment. And it's something of a paradox on its face anyway, that prime ministerial appointees, senators, would be expected in some way to hold this power to account. I'll come back to this. There are reasons why I think the Senate in particular has an important role to play in fulfilling these functions. These responsibilities can't be covered off by the House alone. For one thing, the Senate has a particular responsibility for regional representation, and this is something that I think all senators take very seriously. Second, as an appointed but not an elected institution, senators have the capacity and the unique ability to take a medium to long-term approach to policy. Elected officials can't help but be responsive to a 4-year electoral cycle. This breeds a sense of short-termism that I think is understandable and almost inevitable, and I think that sense of short-termism is very much reinforced culturally outside of Parliament. I think in a lot of ways we actually encourage our elected governments to focus on short-term goals, to focus on deliverables, to have something to show us at the end of an election, a 4-year cycle, to have something to deliver at budget time. I think in a way our electoral democracy almost encourages that, but I think there's a lot of value in the offset of having a body whose members are appointed for a longer and more secure and for a secure time. And so senators are more able to adopt a kind of medium to longer term approach that involves a little bit more planning, because some policies, many policies, especially the complex ones, need that. There is much value, I'm going to argue, in an appointed chamber. So in keeping with the conference theme, maybe the first bold thing I will say is I will not be arguing for an elected Senate in any way through elections or through plebiscites. So thirdly, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to make this point effectively, but I'm going to give it a shot. I think there's a lot of value in the fact that the Senate is not a confidence chamber, as the House is. So it is in a unique position to scrutinize legislation without raising questions about defeating a government. I think it's become a problem for accountability that the House of Commons basically treats everything as a confidence vote. That's not in paper anywhere, but essentially I think we've kind of gotten to the point where defeating anything that comes from the government would be seen as questioning the confidence of the government and its ability to go forward. And I think in a sense that's very paralyzing, because MPs on the governing side are expected to support their government all the time. And this affects their role in committee. It affects their ability to perform the scrutiny function. And I think that's a serious problem. But the stakes are so high, because even on the opposition side, even if we're in a minority government situation, you might not want to defeat the government. You might not want to call into question the government's confidence. There are lots of reasons why you might not want to go to election. But as soon as you start raising questions about the pith and substance of the government's legislation, whether you support this, then we're asking questions about, okay, whether we're going to an election. And I think that's a real problem for scrutiny and accountability, because you can't perform the function effectively if it's all or nothing. So I think if that's the way the House is and that's where we are, it seems to me that the Senate has something very valuable to offer, in the sense that you can have conversations about the quality of a bill, specific parts of it. The scrutiny function can exercise without having those questions about whether the government's going to be able to survive it. And so in that way, they're really not mimicking the House. The Senate is doing something very different. So I also wanted to make the point, too, that it seems, I'm not sure historically what the actual numbers are. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to hearken back to a golden age that may never have been there. But I don't think that governments are terribly shy to invoke closure on debate to get something through the House. I don't know what the statistics are, if we do that more now or less. Somebody probably knows that, I'm not sure. But in that context, it seems that the Senate, in terms of the scrutiny function, has much to bring. It could be a backstop against this sort of rush approach in the House of Commons. And we've seen a lot of that lately. These roles can be performed effectively only if the Senate is truly independent. The institutional design of the Senate should, in theory, at this point, foster independence, because primarily because senators are appointed till age 75. Independence is the primary objective of and justification for security of tenure, it seems to me. Senators are not political appointees in the sense that chiefs of staff are, or other political staffers, in the sense that they do not serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Although senators are appointed by a Prime Minister, all senators are appointed by some Prime Minister, even if it's not the current one, no Prime Minister has the authority to fire them. A Prime Minister, through the power of the Crown, selects senators, but once appointed, senators owe the Prime Minister nothing. Therefore, senators are free to act independently of political leadership. At least that's the theory that's supposed to guide the practice. However, it was the 2013 suspensions of Senators Duffy, Wallen, and Brazo that really gave me cause to question whether and to what extent the Senate, supposedly an independent chamber, might be acting under political influence from the House of Commons. So as not to self-plagiarize myself here, I made a series of these arguments in articles in the Globe and Mail. And this is a point I'll come back to later. It's always fun when you publish an article in a newspaper and the newspaper doesn't allow you to set the title. Because then you open your newspaper the next morning and read how they framed your article, and that's how everyone is going to take it. That's the, not always, but that's the title they're going to see on their website kind of thing. And so I'll come back to that as some interesting experiences I've had specifically writing about the Senate. So the Prime Minister publicly called on the Senate to suspend the 3 senators without pay. This did occur. There was a near unanimous vote by the majority Conservative caucus, though senators on both the Conservative and then Liberal benches raised questions about the propriety of the process that resulted in the suspensions. It's not just the events surrounding the Senate spending scandal and the suspensions that forced questions about Senate independence. Conservative MPs and senators caucused together weekly, and up until last year, Liberal MPs and senators did the same. Caucusing together obviously confers a sense of teamwork. It fosters and of common project, and it fosters the expectation, presumably, that all members of the caucus, MPs and senators alike, work as a team. That's the point. This cultural dynamic could undermine the capacity of senators to act independently of the House of Commons. I also worry that that Senate's perceived lack of legitimacy in the larger public has manifested a kind of an expectation that the Senate will not do what it's actually constitutionally entitled or empowered to do. This is a problem. And I think to an extent, the kind of scandals and the criminal charges and things like that that we've seen come out of the spending issues, that they make that worse. They make the legitimacy problem worse. But I think, I'm not really sure exactly what the problem is, if it's that the public doesn't have a lot of information about what the Senate is supposed to do. But I feel like we're kind of living in a time where if the Senate does what it is constitutionally supposed to, allowed to do, there would be a lot of public backlash to that. It seems like, there's this kind of expectation that the Senate will defer to the elected House. And that might be okay, but it just sort of depends on how the deference happens. And is it still within the context of the Senate performing the scrutiny function along the lines that I have and other people have already talked about. But I think now, the way that our society defines democracy, it's hard to know where an appointed Senate fits into that. Because when people talk about democracy, now it seems like we're talking about transparency, we're talking about openness, we're talking about inclusion, we're looking for ways that the people can get involved in democracy. There always has to be this kind of democratic accountability and check on things, and there's a sense of community. So I'm not really sure how, if people are able to square the concept of an appointed Senate, whatever value it might bring, into our definitions of democracy. It might be that if we expanded our discussions of democracy to include something like balance, which I think is a hallmark of the Westminster system, there might be more room there for the Senate as it exists now. But now I think people find it very difficult to explain how the Senate in its current form makes any sense in a democratic context. Why do we have this body of 105 people who are appointed till they're 75? So very briefly, what do I mean, I guess, by independence? So the word independence implies independence from something. So from party leadership, from the political party itself, or perhaps from senators from each other, from independence from one another in the chamber. So I'm going to say here that what I really mean is an ability to accept, reject, amend, propose legislation independently as an institution and to some extent from individual senators themselves. But I'm not really talking about senators' independence from one another. I'm not saying we should have 105 islands in there where everybody's kind of has no political party and is doing whatever he or she wants. And as Kim Campbell said last night, that won't happen anyway. Factions are inevitable. We will have some sort of organization in the Senate, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I guess what I'm really talking about is an independence from the House of Commons, an independence from political leadership. So, how do we get there? How do we get closer to a Senate that is more independent and therefore more able to do all the things it's supposed to do? So it seems to me we have to put all the proposals for reform through a filter. Does the reform bring the Senate closer to fulfilling its important constitutional functions? So there's a number, obviously, of constitutional reform proposals on the go. And as Simon Potter mentioned this morning, a Senate that is whipped cannot provide an adequate check on democracy. It cannot provide an adequate representative function. And so it seems to me, whether we're talking about an elected Senate, appointment by other means, some other involvement from someone other than the Prime Minister, equal numbers per provinces, how does that bring the Senate closer to an independent exercise of the powers that it has? So, it seems to me that we have, and we've talked about this already, a kind of troublesome allergy to constitutional growth and development in Canada. And other people know more about that than I do, but I think that it's a problem to the extent that constitutions are not supposed to stay the same all the time. They are supposed to be hard to change, and they're not supposed to be malleable by any one government. There's a reason why we have the complex amending formulas that we do, but it's not supposed to mean that constitutions don't change at all. So there's the argument for we have a written constitution and we also have constitutional conventions. And so maybe the change can occur on the informal side where we see conventions growing and changing, and to the point that the operation of the Constitution changes because it's like the annotated parts of the Constitution or the unspoken parts of the Constitution are changing so as to match people's expectations of what should happen. I'm not sure if that really happens. I think that we have a problem to the extent that we don't have the political will to change the text of the Constitution to include more things. So, and we also don't seem to have the political will to develop a cabinet manual. I know that people say we have one, but I mean one like New Zealand has one, like the UK has one, that actually works really well and helps in government transition and helps to answer questions like, if we have 20 Senate vacancies, when does the Prime Minister have to fill them, and who can help him with that? So it seems like there are places that we can make a lot of changes in the text of the Constitution. There's a fly, it's indicated how warm it is, there's a fly around here. To the text of the Constitution, to the unwritten parts of the Constitution, or to constitutional annotations like cabinet manuals, that we'd be able to get a little bit closer to answers to these questions. Normally, I'm the one saying we should change the text of the Constitution. And with Peter O'Coin and with Mark Jarvis, I've said we should put powers to limit the Prime Minister's, we should limit the Prime Minister's power to prorogue and dissolve in the Constitution. We should change our Constitution so that we should have constructive confidence votes, so you can never dismiss a government without introducing a new government. For whatever reason, I'm not arguing that we change the written Constitution now with respect to Senate reform, thank you. Because I think we can make the changes that we need to make without actually changing the written text. So turning very briefly then, because I've used up a vast majority of my time, to the proposal from Justin Trudeau. So last year, as everybody knows, the leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau, made an announcement that said that senators would no longer sit in the Liberal Party. So going back to my comments on on what we mean by democracy, this was very much framed in the context of democratic reform. I'm going to make the Liberal Party caucus more democratic because now you have to be elected in order to get into it. And anybody who is appointed doesn't fit the requirements. So then the question is, what do we do with the senators? Well, the senators now are free to do what they want. They are independent from the Liberal caucus. They, if they want to caucus together, if they don't, they are not any longer sitting in the Liberal caucus. So then, obviously, very quickly, the formerly Liberal senators re-caucus themselves into their own caucus, and there are people who can speak much more effectively here than I can about what that means. But can this idea work? So Trudeau's idea is the Senate will be, future Senate appointments would be made on some sort of merit-based appointment idea where there would be a kind of independent commission that would advise the Prime Minister on all Senate appointments, not province to province, but all of them. And so obviously it's too early to know, whether that would ever happen and what it would look like. There are obvious limitations to the idea to the extent that, but the limitations aren't necessarily negative, that the Prime Minister can't be bound by the Commission. He still has to have a choice. But at the same time, it could bring us closer in the sense that the appointments wouldn't be based on party. They would be based on some other criteria. I don't know really what they would be. But it could be a potential way forward without constitutional change. And I guess something like I'm kind of hoping that we talk about and consider a little bit more today. On the last 2 minutes I have, I wanted to raise the questions that I was going to raise in the last section, but we ran out of time. On the issue of Senate vacancies, I wanted to ask kind of a two-part question. One, it seems to me that the issue of vacancies, the Constitution says that the Governor General shall appoint. So the shall part, it doesn't seem to me, is in any kind of dispute. What the Constitution is missing is the when. When should the Prime Minister appoint? Because if there's no when, then presumably he can keep waiting. And so what do we do with that? Is there a way around that? Is that something that could fit into a cabinet manual or something like that where there is an actual limit on the amount of time that a Prime Minister has to fill vacancies, kind of like by-elections? Thank you. And the other thing I wanted to raise was, I'm not sure about the ability of the Governor General to take advice from anyone else. So the question that Senator Banks raised about whether there can be a change to that convention where the Prime Minister is, if the vacancies aren't being filled, is there something else the Governor General can do? Section 13 of the BNA Act basically says that which the Governor General does in the context of the Constitution, he or she does with the advice and consent of the Privy Council. So I'm kind of looking for clarity on what kind of advice can come to the Governor General in if not from the Prime Minister, then what form would that take? And I think this raises, although this is a little off topic, larger questions about the head of state issue and if we can imagine a different constitutional design, what would a semi-presidential system, how would they handle this? If they're, it would not be a legitimate path forward, I think, from a democratic context for a lot of people if the Governor General stepped in and said, there are 20 Senate vacancies, we need to do something about it. But I guess the status quo isn't so great either. So I am out of time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Laurie, for a very thought-provoking presentation. Next, Professor Linda Trimble.
Thank you, Senator. It's my great pleasure to be here on this beautiful day in a room full of people who want to talk about the Senate. That's very exciting. I'm actually going to be a little bit outrageous, just warning you. Given the media reaction to the Supreme Court's opinion in the Senate reference, one could not fault Canadians for thinking that the sky had suddenly fallen on Senate reform. Did the Supreme Court just kill Senate reform? Asked a columnist for Maclean's magazine, and his answer was an unequivocal yes. That terrible screeching noise you heard this morning was the wheels of Senate reform in Canada grinding to a halt, he declared. Here's another news headline. Supreme Court ensures our widely reviled patronage house will stay forever. The author of that particular article believes the practical effect of the court's opinion is to, quote, make Senate reform impossible. The federal government clearly agrees. Stuck with the status quo on Senate, says Harper after court's rejection, read one newspaper headline. And immediately following the court's opinion, the Prime Minister announced that the Government of Canada will not continue its work on Senate reform. Now, this approach may be politically expedient for the Conservative government. It can publicly throw up its hands in defeat, blaming the Supreme Court for the lack of government action on parliamentary reform. But in my view, it's a politically irresponsible reaction. It dismisses two easily achieved and meaningful reform options. And it precludes a substantive democratic discussion about the future of the Senate. Also, importantly, as a couple of people have raised, it seems the Prime Minister has not actually given up on reforming the Senate. Mr. Harper is undertaking a covert demolition of the upper house by refusing to appoint senators. I call this abolition by stealth. This is where the outrageous part comes in. Because the government cannot unilaterally achieve its Senate vision, it is opting to disassemble the Senate and is refusing to consult with Canadians and their provincial governments about substantive and achievable reforms. So I'll begin my presentation by challenging the federal government's assertion that the Supreme Court decision effectively makes Senate reform impossible. Excuse me. Then I'll discuss the move towards abolition and explain why I think it's reckless and anti-democratic. Finally, I'll end by making a pitch for a truly deliberative process, a national conversation on the future of the Senate, in my view, ideally in the form of a citizens' assembly. Now, officially, the Government of Canada has shut the door on Senate reform. I say officially because of the abolition by stealth thing that's happening. But giving up on reform ignores a couple of obvious modifications that could be enacted quickly and quite easily. The first is removing the property qualification for Senate appointees, and the second is changing the mechanism for selecting senators. In my view, these two initiatives could dramatically alter the makeup of the Senate. So let's start with the property qualification. The Constitution Act 1867 requires every senator to own land worth at least $4,000, plus real and personal property worth at least $4,000 above debts and liabilities. And it's that last part, the above debts and liabilities, that rules most Canadians out, including me. Not that I'm angling for an appointment. In the Senate reference, the Supreme Court was asked whether or not the federal government could unilaterally remove the property qualification. And the court said yes. That the court said yes was read as throwing the Harper government a bone, a kind of, oh, well, you can't have anything else that you want, but you can have this. But I actually think it's much more significant than that. This is a potentially meaningful constitutional amendment, one that could make a difference to the composition of the Senate. Now, the property requirement was clearly designed to build an upper house that represents the propertied elite. As political scientist David Docherty writes, quote, "It is clear that the intention of the framers of the Senate was to use the property qualification as part of the method of making the upper chamber a more elitist and conservative body than the lower house." And the Senate continues to reflect this outmoded perspective as senators overwhelmingly represent the interests of the corporate class. Indeed, some senators own and run businesses while they serve in the Senate. For instance, we have a senator who owns two major sports teams, the Toronto Argonauts and the BC Lions, in case you were wondering. And many others serve as directors or board members of major corporations. In fact, one of the senators at the heart of the expenses scandal, Pamela Wallin, allegedly claimed travel costs for performing exactly these sorts of corporate duties. So, arguably, the interests of the middle or working classes and the economically marginalized could be much more effectively voiced in the Senate if the property qualification was lifted. It's a simple matter of the federal government passing a piece of legislation to remove the property qualification for senators. Now, the province of Quebec would have to agree on this change for its Senate appointees, who are required by the Constitution Act to hold property in the province of Quebec. But there's no evidence that the Quebec government would oppose such a move, and the province might in fact welcome the chance to update an arcane and outdated provision of the Constitution. After all, no one would lose. The corporate elite could still be appointed to the Senate. And arguably, Canadians would gain a great deal if a much wider range of people were qualified for appointment to the Senate. So this initiative might well boost representation from groups that tend to have fewer economic resources, such as women, racialized minorities, and Indigenous Canadians. The second reform is even easier to accomplish because the decision can simply and straightforwardly be taken at the Prime Minister's discretion, and that is to immediately change the appointment process. Even some Conservatives think this is a good idea. The Conservative Party's former campaign manager, Tom Flanagan, urged the government to develop a Plan B for Senate reform in the likely eventuality that the Supreme Court ruling did not go the government's way. Flanagan suggested that provincial advisory committees get the job of recommending names for the consideration of the Prime Minister. Peter Russell, Canada's preeminent constitutional and parliamentary scholar, has an even bolder suggestion, and I quote him, "What if the Prime Minister was brave and principled enough to publicly commit himself to ending patronage to the Senate and agree to be advised on Senate appointments by a nonpartisan Council of Canadians representing all fields of endeavor," end quote. Last January, the leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau, announced that this is the sort of action he would take if his party formed the government. Trudeau recommends a nonpartisan appointment process that would fill the Senate with independents. To show the strength of his intentions, Mr. Trudeau announced that the Liberal senators were ejected from the Liberal Parliamentary Caucus effective immediately. Now, the reaction from pundits was mixed. One columnist called Trudeau's Senate idea fresh, brave, and worth considering. Another judged the proposal, quote, a breathtaking confusion of stupidities, because, of course, the Liberal senators continue to maintain their partisan allegiances. Will Mr. Trudeau actually implement this policy if elected? We will see. I, for one, would be interested to see. Trudeau government would confront a Senate full of Conservative appointees, and the temptation to restack the deck with Liberals might prove rather irresistible. Now, in response to the Liberal Party's position and on an independent Senate, the Prime Minister said that changing the appointments process is merely cosmetic and will do nothing to make the Senate more democratic and accountable. To quote Mr. Harper, "Canadians are not looking for a better unelected Senate. Canadians believe that for the Senate to be meaningful in the 21st century, it must be elected." I'm not sure Canadians believe that, but anyway, without any immediate prospects for an elected Senate, maybe Canadians would prefer a better, more representative, less partisan, unelected Senate. And if the Prime Minister is so determined that the Senate be elected, why hasn't his government pursued this option in a manner respectful of the Constitution? Why didn't he immediately initiate discussions with the provinces about constitutional reform? As the Supreme Court's opinion confirms, and as everybody already knew because we had a previous reference on the topic discussed this morning, a constitutional amendment is necessary to achieve an elected Senate. Here's the Prime Minister's explanation for refusing to even try going that route. Quote, "We know that there is no consensus among the provinces on reform, no consensus on abolition, and no desire of anyone to reopen the Constitution and have a bunch of constitutional negotiations." He's right about the fact that there's no agreement on how to fix the Senate. There never has been. But does this mean we should simply give up on trying to reform the upper house? Absolutely not. We desperately need a national conversation about the role and future of the Senate. As political scientist Emmett McFarlane argues, it is one thing to make the case that the current situation is unpalatable. It is another to answer the question, what should the Senate be for? Of course, Canadians are going to disagree about the answer to this question, and about whether or not we even need an upper house. But saying we can't start the conversation because provincial governments won't be able to reach a consensus suggests Canadians should not have any say in the design of their national institutions. Maybe politicians find some comfort in this self-imposed constitutional straitjacket. It allows them to avoid risk and uncomfortable levels of scrutiny. In my view, Mr. Harper's assertion that there's no desire to reopen the constitutional dialogue is quite short-sighted. Maybe now, in the wake of the Senate scandal, is the perfect time for a round of constitutional deliberations. Everyone's talking about the Senate anyway because of the scandal, and the conversation will heat up again when the Mike Duffy trial begins. The fact that Canadians know so little about the functions of the Senate indicates that a conversation would play a highly useful educative role. Just as an example of a widespread ignorance about the Senate, a public opinion survey published last February found that very few Canadians can explain what senators do on a daily basis, nor can they identify the role of the Senate in the Canadian parliamentary system. So even if nothing came of national deliberations on Senate reform, people would learn about the Senate's past and be encouraged to thoughtfully consider its possible futures. I think we need a constitutional discussion, ideally in the wake of a citizens' assembly on the future of the Senate. But I would certainly not bet any money on the likelihood of a federal government starting constitutional talks in the near future, regardless of which party leads the government. Mr. Harper's belief that there's no desire of anyone to reopen the Constitution is a mantra among federal politicians of all partisan stripes. Political leaders utter this assertion with such synchronistic finality, it is now accepted as capital D truth. We can't talk about the Constitution. That would be a bad thing. But public opinion polls reveal increasing support for constitutional reform in the province of Quebec and indeed across the country. For instance, a survey conducted a couple of years ago, well before the Senate scandal erupted, found 61% of Canadians are prepared to reopen the Constitution in an effort to reform or abolish the Senate. So that's a sizable majority willing to talk about the Constitution. It seems many Canadians have now recovered from the post-traumatic stress disorder produced by previous rounds of constitutional negotiations. And as well, it's not so risky anymore to talk about the Constitution. The Quebec sovereignty movement seems to be in abeyance, so there's less of a risk of sparking a national unity crisis. And another reason to hope for Senate reform via constitutional amendment is because younger people are much more likely than older citizens to prefer reforming the Senate to abolishing it. So the students I teach, the future generations of policymakers, are more positive about the prospects for fixing the Senate. But constitutional reform won't happen under the watch of the present government, which has shut the door on any national deliberation about the future of the Senate and is pursuing abolition by stealth. The federal government seems to be doing its level best to quietly make the Senate disappear. The Prime Minister has stopped appointing senators. The last appointment was made 2 years ago in March 2013, and there are now 20 vacancies. I had 18, Laurie mentioned 20, a lot. In 105-member chambers, that's a lot of vacancies. And that doesn't include the suspended senators. The Prime Minister says he's in no hurry to make appointments. In Mr. Harper's words, we're able to continue to pass our legislation through the Senate, so from our standpoint, the Senate of Canada is continuing to fulfill its functions. According to Emmett McFarlane, who's a political scientist, quote, killing the Senate by simple attrition of its membership is a tactic favored by people who want the upper house gone, but recognize in large part due to last April's Supreme Court reference opinion that Parliament can't institute major reform or abolition by itself. Indeed, former Conservative Senator Hugh Segal recently tipped the government's hand by saying he doesn't think the Prime Minister has any obligation to name senators as long as the Senate meets its quorum of 15 members. Moreover, a major champion of abolition, Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, recently declared, atrophy is not a bad endgame for the Senate. It's a long goodbye, but it is a goodbye. And the NDP, a champion of abolition for a long time, also supports this approach. As leader Tom Mulcair put it, quote, "We could just let the thing die on the vine, just wither away, name no one else to the Senate." So there seems to be a fair amount of support for this abolition by stealth approach, alarmingly. Now, getting rid of the Senate in this manner is quite likely unconstitutional, and perhaps more importantly, it's politically irresponsible. In my view, Canada needs an upper house, not least because of the extreme concentration of power in the executive branch of the national government. The type of careful legislative oversight that the Senate is designed to provide is crucial given the fusion of power. So unless we have some kind of major parliamentary reform, we need a Senate. Now, many thoughtful people are in favor of abolition, and I certainly would like to have the opportunity to participate in a discussion about that option, among others. But abolition by stealth seems designed to avoid talking about the future of the Senate. It is petulant and irresponsible of the current government to throw up its hands in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision and refuse to pursue any form of democratic dialogue on Senate reform. Okay, in the 2 minutes I have left, I will wrap up. In the throes of the Senate scandal, the Premier of Saskatchewan, Brad Wall, tweeted, quote, "Abolition difficult, reform impossible, status quo unacceptable." I agree with Mr. Wall on one point: the status quo is unacceptable. At the very least, the Prime Minister has a duty to address the problems that generated the expenses scandal and to clean up the appointments process. My argument in one sentence is this: status quo unacceptable, abolition by stealth anti-democratic, meaningful reform possible and definitely worth pursuing. As Canadians wait in vain for politicians to agree on how to democratize the institution, maybe we do want a better unelected Senate. The federal government can easily amend the Constitution to remove the property qualification for senators, and the Prime Minister can, in the blink of an eye, revamp the appointments process. I have argued that Canada desperately needs a national dialogue on the fate of the Senate and on its roles and practices, should we decide to keep it. This conversation should itself be fully representative and deliberative. So I advocate the creation of a citizens' assembly on the role and the fate of the Senate. I sincerely hope a future government will gather sufficient courage and, yes, boldness to engage Canadians in a conversation about this important national issue. Thank you.